Yes, hello. We are from Europe indeed, and we want to talk about regulation in Europe with you. But maybe a quick introduction, Chris. Why are you qualified to talk about this topic?
Yes, thanks, and welcome to our panel today. I'm Chris. I'm a regulatory lawyer based in Hamburg, Germany, and I want to talk about NFT regulation today with you all.
Max.
So you got me there. So my name is Max. I'm based in Switzerland, which is officially not part of the EU yet. So I'm not sure how qualified I am to really talk about the topic. But I'm sure I can give a bit of insights how Switzerland is looking at these kind of things and see what's going on. In my daily life, I work for EY in technology consulting, and I lead the Web3 Metaverse topic there in Switzerland. And I'm also part of the Swiss Metaverse Association, but I'll come back to this during the discussion.
Okay, nice. Sounds very good. And yes, my name is Nico. I'm also a lawyer at DLA Piper, based in Germany, and I advise clients on digital business models. Okay, let's get started. Chris, if you think about regulation now, what do you think is the most important issue in Europe now at the moment when you think about NFT projects?
Well, one thing that is discussed all the time is whether NFTs are regulated assets or not, and especially if they are crypto assets that are regulated. And that's a topic at the moment which is not harmonized across the EU. We have the Markets in Financial Instruments Directive, which is implemented in the member states, which regulates crypto assets in the states, but it's not how this applies in each state can be decided by each state. So the result can be different in each state at the moment. In Germany, it's quite good actually. The German regulator, which is the BaFin, just released an article where they said that they are not aware of any NFT that is a security. So they are quite liberal at the moment. So most NFTs are not regulated. But of course, you always have to look in each project whether this might be a security or other regulated assets.
But if I would start a project in Europe, I need to look at the opinions of all authorities in every member states of the European Union, right?
If you want to have full legal certainty, then yes, that's the approach right now that you would have to take.
And are the views harmonized, or is there any connection between the authorities? Do they talk?
Well, it's a directive that is the basic framework, but that does not directly apply to NFTs. So we don't have that harmonized NFT framework. And in the future, there might be a regulation coming that has an impact on NFTs. And this will start with the MiCA regulation. It was also mentioned in the talk before us. I actually had the hope that I could talk to you about this today in its final form, because the original plans were that the European Parliament adopts this regulation already in February, but this didn't happen. And the current plan is that they decide on this regulation next week. And so we have a draft right now, but we don't know if this will be the final draft or if there will be changes, if this will be adopted at all. But based on that draft, we will then have a harmonized regulation about crypto assets in the EU. And this is a regulation that will directly apply in all member states. So we don't have this fragmented system then anymore. However, this regulation actually intends to not regulate NFTs. It mentions that it will not apply to tokens that are non-fungible and unique. But then, however, you always have to look if this project that you want to issue to the market is really such a project with tokens that are non-fungible. And the interesting thing will be to define whether this is the case for your project or not, whether you fall under this regulation or not.
Okay, Max, and your perspective from Switzerland?
So, I mean, one very important thing is I think that we're actually having this discussion, that it's being addressed also on a political stage. It's also happening in Switzerland, for example, so I think that is very important. I mean, in general, Switzerland is very crypto-friendly. Like, we have blockchain regulations, we have a lot of blockchain, crypto, Web3 startups or companies in Switzerland. We have the Crypto Valley near to Zug, for example, where we have Signum Bank, which is like a regulated bank dealing with crypto assets. So the overall environment is very, very, I would say, understanding and very open for it. But again, it's a bit similar to the EU. There are no clear rules or guidances on NFTs specifically. On tokens, yes. I always say a token is a little bit like a cup, and it depends on what is in the cup. So you have to look at it on a use case basis. If it's a native token, it's a payment token, and utility is utility token, and so on and so forth. Maybe it's an asset token. And then when it comes to the NFT, you have to look into the NFT specifically. What kind of NFT is it to classify it? In Switzerland, it's the FINMA, the Financial Markets Supervisory Authority, that regulates and classifies these kind of things. It's been worked on, but it is also a little bit unclear.
And would you say, as soon as the MiCA regulation comes, that there is a more harmonized view also in regards to Switzerland? So would it be like the same in Switzerland as in the rest of the European Union?
I would hope so, and probably yes, to most of the degrees. Also, to your point as well, if you take NBA Top Shots, for example, which are a financial instrument, they would also not be classified as a financial instrument in Switzerland. So it's very similar to what's happening in the EU, I would say.
Okay, nice. Maybe from my point of view, if you think about regulation, you also, of course, need to think about e-commerce topics, consumer protection law. This topic is already very much governed in the European Union. We have very strict consumer protection laws, also in Germany. What is good is that this is also harmonized in the European Union. However, all member states are allowed to add something to this already existing framework on the EU level, which means that also in regards to consumer protection law, the market is still very fragmented in the European Union. That also means that if you start a project in the EU, you also need to consider all consumer protection laws in every member state of the EU, which is, to be honest, a nightmare, because every country is very different. We just started a project which affected France and Germany, and even between these two countries, there are so many differences. And if you start a project and want to, for example, offer an NFT to consumers, you really need to be aware of that as well.
Is there something that you can recommend to someone who wants to start an NFT project and who maybe does not have the budget yet to pay for lawyers in every state?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I mean, Porsche launched their NFT a few weeks ago, and what they did, they took a very country-specific approach. So they had dedicated terms and conditions for every country involved. And that is, of course, a good approach for a big brand, because they can like lose their reputation. And I would always recommend, if you're a big brand and if you want to start a project in Europe, maybe you are already also a European brand, then you have to do that, I would say. If you are a project on a small budget, you can, of course, take a risk-based approach and say, okay, I want to orientate me on a very strict law, for example, in Germany, which is, I would say, the strictest law in the European Union in regards to consumer protection law. You can do that, but of course, you always have the risk that you don't comply with certain specific small points in, for example, France. And it's always combined with a risk, of course.
What about Switzerland? How's their view on customer protection?
So I really like what was said on the previous panel. You have to be a bit careful that there are rules and they will probably change, and you have to be accountable for what's happening in hindsight as well. So, and if I look at what's happening in the NFT space overall, and also what companies are doing, I think they have been a little bit careless, if I may use that word. So that's something I probably would not recommend. I mean, what you said is probably seems like a sensible solution, to go with like the strictest, and that's probably going to be on the safe side. An interesting thing for Switzerland, for example, is when it comes to NFTs, when you hold and flip NFTs, for example, as a private person, there are no capital gains tax, so you're good. Also, if I trade stocks in my not for fun, but in my free time, so to say, I don't pay capital gains tax on it. If I'm a company, or if I do it as a self-employed person, I do pay taxes on it. So I have to make sure I'm aware of this. and also as a private person, because I know a lot of private people are in the space and launch their own collections. The question is, and that's a little bit unclear, when are you considered a business or self-employed, and when do you actually have to pay taxes on the NFTs you flip, on the NFTs you buy and sell? And that's something you should have to consider, I guess, because especially Switzerland is very, very cautious that everyone is paying taxes. So I would recommend.
It's the same in Germany. I'm sorry.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'll make sure you're on the safe side there as well. Yeah.
That's what we are telling our clients, that this is probably the first stop where they get into contact with the authorities.
100%, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but I advise companies on the strategy, and we help them implement it. And of course, reg tech and taxes are an important part. And I'm sometimes a little bit surprised how little they have been informing themselves before they enter the space. So they would like, let's just do it, let's try it out. If we fall on our faces, no problem. That is something that might have worked a year ago, but that's not something I would recommend anymore.
Nico, one thing I've heard about in NFT projects is the right of withdrawal. It sounds a bit strange, but I think that's a European thing that you know about.
Yes, indeed, that's a very European thing indeed. Maybe it's also like translated to like the right to change your mind. So if you buy something in an online store, you can basically say, I don't want it, I send it back. That also applies in regards to digital goods, of course. So if I buy an app in the Apple App Store, I can say I want to return this app in theory. There are certain ways like to tailor this a little bit more to projects like NFT projects. So for example, you can add to the interface when you mint the NFT that the consumer minting the NFT waives this right to change his mind. And that's the way to do it. And if you take a close look to many projects, they don't implement that. So in theory, you could like already say, I want to give back this NFT you bought like 6 months ago, because German law is very strict in this regard. If you don't inform the consumer about this right he has, he can use this right for a very, very long time. But this is something you can take care of. I think that's maybe the most crucial point in regards to every regulation in the European Union. You just need to think about it, and you just need to think about whether you really want to like apply it and how you want to handle this in your project. Not thinking about it is always a fault, I would say.
Is this also something that Switzerland applied?
I believe so. I have to admit, I'm not 100% sure, but it is an issue that always, of course, occurs also in Switzerland. So I'm sure it's being looked into. One other thing I find quite important, coming back to maybe what you asked in the very first place, how do you even? So I think it's very important to make sure politics is involved, and that politics understands what this is all about, that blockchain and NFTs aren't money laundering, that nothing to do with narcotics, gambling, or pornography. Maybe, but sometimes there are other use cases for it. And for a lot of people still have this misconception. So, and a lot of politicians, they don't have the time or the technical knowledge to really deep dive into these kind of topics. So they think, oh, it's blockchain, money laundering, nothing to do with this. So I think the educational journey of this all is very, very important. And I mean, I see this in the EU and also Switzerland picking up a lot more. Also that also in the US, that politics have an open ear, and they want to have the dialogue and really discuss what are use cases. And I think that's very important to really show that there are use cases beyond what everyone was talking about, and that they actually have benefit, they actually have value, so people are listening more and more and more.
Yeah, one thing that you mentioned that I want to like to pick up on is the AML regulation, because that's also something that is kind of harmonized across the EU. We have AML directives that apply in all member states. However, they also have to be transposed into the local law, so there might be differences in specific cases. And NFTs are certainly one of the specific cases that are not regulated exactly the same across the member states. In Germany, for example, you usually are not regulated under AML laws when you're issuing an NFT project. However, it is possible that you have a very specific NFT, for example, so an NFT that can be paid by cash, or that grants the right to get a physical artwork, and then you might fall under the AML laws, and then you have to KYC your customers.
So as soon as there is a utility, there is a risk that you need to comply with this law.
If that utility is a physical artwork, then
So it must be
then,
artwork.
then you have to
If I
look
get
close on this.
but if I get a sweater where like the logo is printed on, is that already
No,
art?
that usually not. It depends on your definition. No. No, but usually not. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, and Chris, you already mentioned the MiCA. I mean, let's talk about future regulation. Is there anything on the horizon project needs to be aware of?
Yes, the MiCA regulation, because the authorities are then authorized to set guidelines to see which assets are actually crypto assets that are regulated and which are not. And the MiCA regulation, the draft of it, mentions NFTs, and it mentions that digital collectibles are not regulated by it, but then you have to see what is a digital collectible. The other part is it regulates utility tokens, as long as they are non-fungible. Then you have to see what does non-fungible mean. And the draft mentions that large collections are an indicator for being fungible. So, and then the question is, what is a large collection? The draft does not define what is large. Is a 10K PFP collection a large collection? Is this then not non-fungible? So is it fungible? Is it regulated or not? And these are open questions that we and the authorities will have to look into when this regulation applies.
And when you say authorities, would that mean that the authorities in each member state can have a different view about these items, or is it like regulated on a high level, on the EU level then?
Yeah, so the European Securities Agency will publish guidelines.
Okay.
And that's what MiCA intends. And these guidelines are intended to harmonize this across Europe, because the regulation is a regulation that applies directly in all member states. And the intention is that the fragmentation that we have now will be discontinued then.
And how is the timing on the MiCA regulation? When do you expect it to be like in place?
Yeah, so next week will be the hearing in the parliament. If they agree, and there was a political agreement last year that they want this regulation, so it would be surprising if they don't agree in the parliament, but you never know. Other legislation also didn't happen because of disagreements, but let's see. If they agree, then the regulation has to be published in the official journal. This takes a few weeks maybe, because it has to be written down and put into the journal, and then the first parts will enter into force a year later. This is for stable coins, and the full regulation will enter into force about 1.5 years later, 18 months. So we can expect the regulation to start at the end of 24 or beginning 25.
And Max, what will Switzerland do? Will they adopt some parts of the MiCA? Or is it likely that they get inspired by it?
I think so, yes. Because what you said as well, that's what you read in all the Swiss papers as well, that you get an indication, but what does it exactly mean? What's high volume? What's a large collection? There's an indication, but it's not really clear. So I think that needs to be done. I think the MiCA efforts are amazing. So I think that's where Switzerland will probably tend to take something of it into account. I hope so.
That's the intention of the European regulator, that they are one of the first that regulate this in all details, and that the other countries around them look into this and maybe even adopt it too.
Exactly, and I think that's exactly what's needed. You have a first mover that is bold, that is brave, and does the first step, and says, okay, that's how we're going to handle it, and then I think it's a bit more clear. It also makes then a lot more safer for companies, and if we look at like the big picture in terms of mass adoption and where the space should go, I think that's what's one part of what's needed to really bring this to another level. Yeah, but I'm quite curious. I was thinking in my head while you guys were talking. From a legal perspective, what are the questions or the common questions clients asking you? What's the most common topic you help clients with?
Well, I think IP is an important question, of course. E-commerce, consumer protection law is very important as well. I think all topics Chris covers, like regulation, is also quite important. Something else?
One thing that is kind of special, but that always has to be checked, is gambling regulation, actually, because a lot of NFT projects have this mechanics where you can win something, or where you don't know what you're buying at the moment of buying, and then it gets revealed later, and then you could possibly get a valuable NFT. So, and you pay for it. So you're kind of into gambling regulation, and you have to make sure that those licensing requirements are not triggered by your NFT project.
So that's basically you go then and study the white paper of the projects and help them ideally also maybe set it up.
Yeah, and do their terms and conditions and say you have to explain what the customer gets, and this also runs into the Nico's topic of consumer protection. You have to be clear what the consumer, what your customer gets when he pays, and I, from a regular point of view, look that this is unregulated, or if it's regulated, that you get the proper license that you need for it.
And maybe in regards to future regulation as well, in my area, we will get the Digital Services Act, which will regulate online platforms, especially in regards to user-generated content. This will enter into force next year, and this will also have a huge impact on NFT projects, of course. So as soon as there's an interface to the customer where he uploads certain information or certain graphics, for example, this is user-generated content under the Digital Services Act, and then projects need to also comply with that as well. And if you, for example, operate a Discord for your project, this will also be regulated by the DSA, Digital Services Act. In addition to that, maybe we get the AI Act, which will regulate the use of artificial intelligence, which could also have an impact on NFT projects. And maybe as a last topic, we will get the Data Act as well. So the EU is very active, as you can see. We will get the Data Act, which gives the consumers certain rights so that they can export their data, which can also have an impact on certain projects as well.
But when you mention data, we already have the General Data Protection Regulation.
That's a very good point indeed. So it's a topic we are always discussing in these panels. So is it, if I, for example, mint an NFT, is there an exchange of personal data under the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation? And we say yes, because it's very likely that your wallet can be doxed. For example, if you use your clone X as your profile picture on Twitter, and everybody knows that this is your dedicated profile, everybody also knows that this wallet belongs to you. So we can say as soon as you mint an NFT with your wallet, there is an exchange of personal data between you as the consumer and the project as the operator. So yes, in this case you need a privacy policy, you need a cookie policy, and this is already the case. Yes, very good point.
And a lot of projects use third-party providers. Yeah. For example, Discord that you mentioned, or they have a Twitter page, or they do a Google form where they collect customer data, and this is all covered by the Data Protection Regulation.
Okay, so maybe quick sum up. Chris, your top topic for regulation in the EU, what would you recommend for NFT projects?
Get a good lawyer, of course.
Max?
Get a good consultant.
Okay, then I combine both, get a good consultant and a good lawyer. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.